Inside the Avatar Studio brings together innovative leaders from virtual technology frontiers to discuss perceptions, perspectives, and predictions of what being virtual means in today's society. I'm your host, Kevin Feenan, and with me today is Alice Krueger, also known as Gentle Heron in Second Life. Alice is president of the nonprofit Virtual Abilities Incorporated and founder of the Virtual Ability Community. As a woman with multiple sclerosis, she found it increasingly difficult to participate in her real-life community as her disability progressed. No longer able to leave home to work, volunteer, or socialize with friends, she turned to virtual worlds to fulfill these basic human needs. Alice and I will be discussing current issues and trends surrounding the implications of virtual experiences have for people with disabilities and the affordances that virtual reality opens new opportunities to redefine the question, what is normal anyways? Alice, thank you for being here and welcome to Inside the Avatar Studio.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. I know your questions are always thought-provoking.
Well, I try. I try. I wanted to start off the conversation today with this idea of what is normal. And it appears from a quick look at in comparison of the U.S. Census statistics from 2010 and 2015, that the general proportion of the population with some form of a disability remains fairly consistent in roughly about the 20% range. However, it's also apparent that the percentage of the population that experiences some form of disability increases dramatically as we get older. Obviously, as people live longer lives, the percentage goes up significantly after the age of 75. So the next 20 years are when most of the baby boomer generation are going to be entering into their late 70s. Would it be fair to assume that the idea of what is normal is also going to shift during this time as well?
Kevin, I want to get on a soapbox for a second here. I really wish people wouldn't use the word normal to mean non-disabled, because they are not antonyms of each other. Normal is a relative term, and it changes, of course, throughout the lifespan. If you were to ask if it would feel normal to you to lie on your back, make inarticulate noises to express the fact that you had a need to either be fed or to have your diaper changed, you would think that was not normal now. But certainly it was normal when you were 5 months old. So that is an idea about normality. The whole thing about normal and using it to mean non-disabled is part of that medical model of disability. The medical model of disability looks at those of us with disabled as being deviants from what is normal or idealized. And so people talk a lot about curing your defect or curing your deficit or fixing your disability. And this can be a real trap for people with disabilities because some of us try really hard to pass as normal by trying to hide our disabilities and use our abilities. But does that mean we're denying our disability? And of course, there's the super crips, the people who you see on the Paralympics. They certainly deserve to be lauded for their abilities, their extreme abilities, but they're not like most people with disabilities, just like most super athletes are not like most non-disabled people. So you kind of need to remember that we're a person first, but we really shouldn't try and deny our disabilities. And my friend Mook reminded me of something that I needed to remember to address this question. She reminded me of Martha's Vineyard in Massachusetts, and this is an island off the coast of Massachusetts that has been around for a long time. The community there used to be pretty isolated because the island was a little bit farther than normal off the mainland, and it had a genetic component to the community of deafness. It had a much greater percentage of people who were deaf there. and the community's economy was based on fishing and farming. And the hearing and the deaf people on Martha's Vineyard had invented their own sign language, community sign language, that was used on that island by people to communicate across the distances. If you're out in a fishing boat and you need to communicate with somebody else on a fishing boat, the easiest way probably is to sign rather than to try and yell across the ocean. So is that normal? The deaf and the hearing people using sign language. So as to your question, will our culture's acceptance of what is normal change as the population ages? Well, I kind of think it already has. If you think about it, in the 16th to the 18th century, back then, the life expectancy was to the 30s or 40s. So if someone was 45 years old, they were considered ancient. That was not normal to live that long. And now, what is our life expectancy? 75, 80, 75 plus, somewhere in that range. So yeah, I think the definition of normal is changing because it is a relative and culturally defined term.
Right. So, and I guess one of the things that I was interested in was this idea, because partially you were talking about this idea of acceptance, right? And to a certain extent, there's this stereotype out there of a disability being a deviancy. And I'm wondering whether or not have things really started to change over the last 10, 20 years?
Has the conception of disability as deviancy changed? Is that what you asked?
Yeah, to a certain extent, yeah.
It is starting to change. I think we still have a long way to go. And you put up a cartoon that was shared with me on the left side of the stage, our right side. And I'll describe it for the people who can't see it. It's a woman surrounded by a dozen cats, and she is saying to us, I was normal 3 cats ago. So she has defined normal in terms of cat ownership.
Right. So in terms of this idea of, because there's a couple of different things that you mentioned, like you were talking about this idea about the whole concept of normal as being a trap.
The thing is, it's a trap if you think that you need to match someone else's definition of normal. If you're okay with yourself, that's okay. It's not a trap. But if you accept society's definition of normal and you don't match that definition, that's a trap. And Wilson is saying we're all different, and thank goodness for that, and I totally agree.
Well, I guess I find it's kind of interesting because, to a certain extent, this sort of speaks a little bit to the second point that I wanted to bring up, is this idea that, I guess to a certain extent, one of the things that I have difficulty dealing with or understanding, right, is this idea of why we segment, right? Why we segment groups and why we're consistently doing this. And it seems to be something that actually occurs a little bit more in the U.S. than that does in Canada, but obviously occurs up here a lot as well. Right? So, when we talk about disabilities in the form of statistics, it becomes very easy to generalize or lump everybody into a very similar bucket. However, this isn't really accurate, because as soon as we start talking about disabilities, we have disabilities pertaining to mobility, to speech, to hearing, cognitive, psychology. There's a lot of different subgenres or specialized impairments that allow, to a certain extent, I think there's a lot of benefit with regards to, creating those subgenres, simply because, they have very specialized needs. At the same time, I think it becomes, it sort of marginalizes the ability to have a conversation about disabilities in general, right? Considering how how pervasive and how wide-ranging it is, right? And so I guess one of the things that I'm wondering about is this idea in terms of, when we want to have a conversation about issues facing people with disabilities in general, in order to get some consensus about where the gaps are and what we should be doing moving forward, how do we do that without getting down into this compartmentalization of different groups?
Well, you've touched on something that I've often thought about. We talk a lot about the disability community. And I often wonder, is it a community? Because we are the most diverse minority group, and you can kind of do an analogy to help you think about this. We talk about Hispanics, but is a Hispanic living in Western Colorado really the same culturally as a Hispanic living in Puerto Rico, or a Hispanic living in Argentina, or a Hispanic living in Spain? Culturally, I think they're very different. And there are so many different ways to divide up the disability community. You could talk about the nature of the disability. Is it a physical disability? Is it a mental disability? Is it an emotional disability? Is it a developmental disability, or is it a sensory disability like deafness or blindness? We also see a lot of differences between the acquisition time of the disability. Is it present from birth? Did it happen when you were a child? Did you acquire it later in life? There's also a lot of difference between how noticeable the disability is. Is it a visible disability, or is it an invisible disability? And then I see some of my multiple sclerosis friends in the audience. Is it a stable disability, or is it a progressive disability? And the thing is, and you mentioned this, because of legislation, different rules apply. And I'm just going to read some of the legislative rules that we have in the United States. We have a U.S. Social Security Administration that determines a lot of the financial aid that is given from the federal government to our people with disabilities. And that U.S. Social Security Administration has this rule, quote, "There are a number of special rules for people who are blind that recognize the severe impact of blindness on a person's ability to work. For example, the monthly earnings limit for people who are blind is generally higher than the limit that applies to non-blind disabled workers." So what that means is that a person with blindness as their disability is allowed to earn more money without losing their federal benefits than a person with any other kind of disability. And then, of course, we have all the tax rules. We have the lovely U.S. Internal Revenue Service. And I will quote some examples from their publication 502, which is the information about deductible medical expenses. First quote, quote, "You can't include in medical expenses the cost of household help, even if such help is recommended by a doctor. This is a personal expense that isn't deductible. However, you may be able to include certain expenses paid to a person providing nursing-type services." And this impacts people like me because with MS, you get a tremendous amount of fatigue. Your doctors are always saying, do whatever you can, hire whatever help you can get to cut down on your fatigue. Well, I can't deduct that, even though the doctor is recommending it. So here's another quote. Quote, "Except for insulin, you can't include in medical expenses amounts you pay for a drug that isn't prescribed. Example, your doctor recommends that you take aspirin. Because aspirin is a drug that doesn't require a physician's prescription, you can't include its cost in your medical expenses." So that's great if your doctor is into complementary and alternative medicine and prescribes herbal medications. You can't deduct that. Here's another one, another quote from the Internal Revenue Service. Quote, "You can include in medical expenses the costs of buying, training, and maintaining a guide dog or other service animal to assist a visually impaired or hearing disabled person or a person with other physical disabilities. In other words, if you're a veteran with PTSD and you have a companion dog, tough luck, you can't deduct that from your taxes. There are other examples that I could give, but my point is that our rules and regulations are not even in terms of people with different types of disabilities. So if we're pitted against each other for recognition or for funding, how is that going to help us overall if we view ourselves as a community of persons with disabilities? And that doesn't mean that I'm asking for equal treatment. It only means that what I hope for is equitable treatment. And the difference is really important. Equal treatment means we all get the same treatment. Equitable treatment means we get the fair treatment that allows us all to rise to the same level.
Well, and actually that's something that, I mean, I hate to say it, but I mean, it's almost as if the system is, for lack of a better term, deliberately gamed in such a way that it tries to keep the different groups off balance to a certain extent.
Well, I can understand why there need to be ways to distinguish different types of people and their needs. That makes sense to me. But if you're not going to treat people fairly, if you're not going to treat people in a way that allows all of us to rise to our full capability, then that is a very bad system.
Right. Is that on the, I don't know the correct way to put this, but I mean, is that on the community itself, though, or is that on the policymakers that are being pushed by special interest groups inside the special interest group type of thing?
Oh, I think it's both. I think that the legislators and the policymakers need to be more aware of the diversity of needs within the community. And I think that our community needs to stop the infighting and support each other better. I think that's definitely a problem. Right.
I guess to a certain extent, and this is sort of coming, and I sort of want to drag some of these ideas back to this idea of this, I guess, of quote unquote normalcy, because, I mean, depending upon the degree or the severity of the disability or the impairment, I guess to a certain extent, it could look as if some groups are taking advantage, whereas other groups, which really do need more help than others, right, are not necessarily getting the help that they need, right? And I'm wondering how we can sort of bring that conversation back to sort of like a middle point where, we can really start to have more concrete discussions about, these particular types of things without dragging things down into, who's better off or who's worse off or who's more deserving or any of those other types of things.
Yeah, those are hard questions. One of the things that I thought very hard about when we were first setting up Virtual Ability as a community 10 years ago was, what really do we as a diverse community need? And one of the things that we need is more exposure to each other so that we can respect each other's diversity, each other's needs, and each other's abilities. And so we purposefully set up Virtual Ability as a cross-disability community. There are over 120 different other communities in Second Life that are for one or a few types of disability. And that's fine. That's definitely necessary. That sort of peer support is absolutely necessary. But I wanted Virtual Ability to be a cross-disability community so that we could all learn from each other and all support each other and move forward together.
Right. And while virtual, I guess you guys are getting into close to 10 years now, aren't you?
Yes. We started in 2007.
2000, yeah. So roughly around the same time that Rockcliffe was around. So over the last 10 years, I mean, how well has that actually been coming together? I mean, has there been significant improvement that you've seen?
In the overall world, I think it's very gradual. Within virtual ability, I see a lot of, I won't call it tolerance because that emphasizes the differences. I'll call it acceptance of diversity. And I see that increasing all the time within our own little community here.
Are there things that you see that are happening with inside virtual worlds that have the capability of going beyond this idea of being virtual, that being able to take these concepts and being able to bring them to other people that are not involved with virtual worlds?
I don't think this grew out of the virtual world, but one example that I know of in Colorado, the electric company was petitioned by a number of peer support groups for different types of disabilities that were heat sensitive. Multiple sclerosis happens to be one of those. Heat is very damaging to us. And those of us whose doctors will recommend that we have air conditioning can receive our electric bills at a lower rate because we need to have the air conditioning because of our disability. And that was due to not lobbying by one individual group, but by a set of related groups. And I think we're going to see more and more of that.
Right, but that came out of the local community, though. That didn't come out of the virtual community.
Yes.
Virtual ability sort of taking the conversation beyond where we are here right at the moment, or will the conversation always be, to a certain extent, sort of centered on virtual worlds?
Oh, I think there's coming to be more and more of a relationship between the two. We've always supported a lot of researchers within the virtual worlds on disability issues, and we see more of those all the time, and that's very good. We also have our professional conferences, and we're seeing interest in that use of the virtual world as a way to relate to others through the conference sessions without having to travel. So, that's much more ecological. So that's another benefit of the virtual world.
Okay. All right. I wanted to further explore this idea of bias a little bit. Specifically, I mean, it was interesting because, I mean, as I was looking up some of the statistics, and you always sort of know this sort of in the back of your head, but I mean, it's interesting to look at the census, some of the census data, and looking at the fact that there is very significant disadvantages that extend into the area of employment, income level, education, enrollment, and various other factors, right? In general, and there's a very clear trend inside the census data that living with a disability essentially means that you're missing out on half the opportunities, like literally half the opportunities afforded to everyone else, right? And, in terms of you look at enrollment statistics with regards to higher education, those are down, 30, 40, 50%. You look at employment, especially with regards to income figures, again, 30, 40, 50% in terms of a differential between and I realize this because we were just talking about this is a trap as I'm going to say this, but it's people who are perceived as being able-bodied, right, end up having these opportunities that other people don't necessarily get, even though they're potentially fully capable of working to the same level as everybody else, notwithstanding the challenges that have been put in their way, right? So, are there specific biases that you feel that contribute to this to a greater or lesser extent? I mean, is this just simply us still being ignorant, right? And us, but I mean us as a community as a whole, because I mean it's obviously there has to be something that accounts. If it was only 5%, I could understand it being, oh well, that's just static, that's noise in the data, right? But when you're looking at 50, 60% differences, right? That's not noise. That's a bias, right? And the
Well,
bias has to be coming from somewhere.
I'd rather not call it a bias because that's placing blame. Let's look at it as barriers. In 2013, the Wharton School of Business did a bunch of research. They asked employers why they were not hiring people with disabilities. And one of the reasons given was that many employers don't think they have the funds available to hire and accommodate and train persons with specific disabilities. There don't seem to be very many resources to help employers recruit people with disabilities for open jobs. And people with disabilities often fear self-identifying to a potential employer as a person with a disability because they think they're going to be discriminated against. And why? What is the problem with discrimination? I think it's a bunch of misconceptions. One of these misconceptions that you hear fairly often is that, gosh, if I hired a person with a disability, it's going to cost me, big bucks to accommodate them. The Job Accommodation Network, JAN, which, by the way, has an office here in the virtual world, the Job Accommodation Network did another survey of employers, and they found that 60% of the accommodations needed by persons with disabilities cost absolutely nothing. And almost all the other accommodations were less than $500. So that's really not a good argument that it's going to cost too much to hire a person with disabilities. And absenteeism is another one. But the research, Job Accommodation Network research, says that actually the absenteeism rate is lower for people with disabilities than it is for people who do not have disabilities. It's lower. And they tend to stay on the same job. They don't job hop like a person without a disability. And of course, some people, maybe this is a bias, some people believe that there's no way that a person with disabilities could have the specific skills or abilities that are necessary to do whatever job it is that they're hiring for. And so that probably is a bias. But I think a lot of it is misconception, and if we're given a chance, we can show that it's not true, and we need to be allowed to show that.
And yet there's, like, every so often I see commercials or public service announcements or what have you that I think try to get part of that message across to, just as sort of like a general public service announcement type thing. Would this not be something like from a, again, from a public policy perspective or from a, trying to engage the public more effectively on disabilities and what it is and what it isn't, right? Would this not be an area of opportunity to basically say, here's something that applies equally to everybody across the board? It doesn't matter whether your disability is due to sound or sight or mobility or genetics or whatever else.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Awareness is going to be very critical. And the public can help us with this because the public is the former of our culture. It forms our culture. And then usually politics and legislation reflect our culture. So I think that's an important place to look to change the status quo, is to the general public. And that's one reason that we have so many public events at Virtual Ability. We want to showcase our abilities. We have a public library that showcases works by persons with disabilities. We have a public art gallery that showcases writings by persons with artwork by persons with disabilities. So we're looking at the ability first and the dis much lesser.
I guess to a certain extent, one of the things that I've noticed, and this doesn't apply just within the virtual worlds. I mean, I've seen this with scouting. I've seen this with the United Way. I've seen this with all kinds of other volunteer organizations. I mean, you look at things like Doctors Without Borders. Notwithstanding how well you try to get the message out there, quite often it seems to be the same. And this is drastically understating things, so please don't sort of beat me up for it. But it's the same dozen people that show up to a lot of these things, right? And like I said, I mean, it doesn't matter whether you're talking about what we're doing in here in terms of virtual worlds, or whether you're talking about Doctors Without Borders, or you're talking about Greenpeace, or what have you. There's a specific demographic that's sort of drawn to those particular issues. Do you see there being a way that we can draw other people in to the conversation to be able to extend it beyond what we're currently doing? Like, is there something more that we could be doing to really engage people on a level that is meaningful to those who don't have a vested interest in and that's probably saying it wrong as well. But I mean, I think you know what I mean, right? I mean, it's...
Well, one of the things that you'll find happening in virtual worlds is people will be friends and they'll do things in the virtual world. And suddenly one will reveal that he or she has a disability, and the other person will say, "Oh goodness, I had no idea." Because often the virtuality, the avatar, can mask some of the features that are easily perceived in the physical world. And sometimes that helps people without disabilities realize that a person with a disability is actually more like them than different from them.
Yeah, I know for myself. I mean, there's a lot of people that I've met in here, and if they hadn't said anything, I certainly wouldn't have known. I mean, one of the great examples I like pointing out is Tim Short.
Yes.
Right, because I mean, it's here's somebody who's really sort of, for lack of a better term, been given the short end of the stick, no pun intended, and yet he does such amazing things being a quadriplegic, right? Like, I mean, I think just recently he finished redesigning his own wheelchair, in terms of working with designers and everything else, and a lot of the coding assignments and what have you that he does and he works on, as a coder, as a builder inside these particular environments. I think I'm trying to remember the lady's name, but a few years back there was this, there was a big deal being made out of it. The one lady who had the sort of the seeing eye dog in here,
yes,
who was completely blind.
Yes, we have several completely blind people in Second Life. Yeah, and most people don't realize that it's possible.
So, in terms of virtualization, though, I mean, does that? Because in some respect, you've got groups like High Fidelity, which are going out there and they're basically saying, we want to make the technology such that you feel as if you're actually dealing with the actual person on the other end. So High Fidelity is making this big deal about the fact that the camera is looking at your facial expressions and then communicating that through the avatar, right, to somebody 3 worlds away type of thing. And yet, to a certain extent, it's almost as if those particular types of advancements are not necessarily the things that are going to bring us closer together.
Probably not. If you were to see my face in the physical world, you would probably think that I had had a stroke on the right side, because I can't move the right side of my face very much. And if you were to project my face onto the avatar, it would not look normal, quote unquote, normal. If you were to put people's facial expressions into a virtual avatar, it would make it much more difficult for people on the autism spectrum to communicate with us, because that confuses many people on the autism spectrum when they have to try and interpret body language, facial expressions, gestures. So yeah, things that may help a few people. I think deaf people would definitely appreciate it if they could lip read, because just I mean, the lips move on the avatars when you speak, but you can't lip read it. But if they could lip read, that would be great. If they could get the hands to work to make language, that would be fantastic for deaf people. So these improvements are going to help some parts of the community and are going to disadvantage other parts of the community.
Right. And I know that you've done a lot of work with Linden Lab and with the Firestorm folks to try to make the browsers for, the open simulator environment, the Second Life environment here, more accessible. Right? Do you guys have any plans to actually carry that beyond into things like high fidelity and Sansar and other technologies as they come out?
We haven't really had too much luck. What we're finding is that as long as the viewer technologies are very diverse, that is allowing us to accommodate people with a lot of different kinds of needs. We haven't really made any inroads into having the design of the viewers be more accessible. But as long as there's so many different, if you look at Second Life, there's 3 or 4 different ways to do any one action. And because of that, we can usually find some way to get a person's assistive technology or their physical capabilities to interact, and so they can use Second Life. Speech to text would be marvelous if we could do that.
Oh, on a regular basis? Oh, heck yeah. even for people like me. I know we have a lot, so on the Virtual World's Best Practice in Education conference, right, we have a lot of people that show up and they don't pre-prepare their talk in advance. And I know you guys have been pushing me to do that more, and I've been trying my best to do that. But
you have been made really big strides. I'm very proud of you.
Well, I try, and we're trying to promote that as much as we can. Quite often, though, and the most common excuse that we get is that people basically are saying, I prefer to do it, off the top of my head, right? And to a large extent, even I like to do that as well. But one of the things that I found is that recently I've picked up Dragon Naturally Speaking, and when it works, because it doesn't always work, I can actually go through my speech, do it off the top of my head, do a practice run, and it will copy all the all the text is there. I got to clean some of it up, but I've got a practice run at it, and at least I've got a version that I can bring in world with me. Right, but it's interesting though, because I think in part one of the things that seems to be missing, and I'm going to come back to this idea of public policy for a moment. So, we've got there's various different pieces of legislation out there. So the Americans with Disability Act is the big one that I think most people are familiar with, simply because of the Section 508 requirements, which essentially are saying that anybody who's within government or is government funded needs to make their electronic communications accessible. And so most universities, anybody that's getting government funding is trying to do those particular types of things. But yet there doesn't seem to be a lot of standards. There's no ANSI standards, there's no ISO standards, there's no EU standards out there in terms of what good enough looks like. Now, is that just me not doing enough research, or is that in fact the case, right? Is that a gap that's currently existing out there?
It is a fact. I know that IEEE for several years was trying to look at creating standards for virtual worlds, and they gave it up. I know that the excuse being given, and I will call it an excuse because I am pointing blame, is that, there's all these virtual worlds out there. It's too late to create any sort of standards for them. But that's really a false idea, because there were a lot of websites out there before the website standards were created for accessibility, and now people need to work on those. So I think there's some very big gaps.
Right. Are there a few other ones that you see that are sort of out there right at the moment that would sort of breach that that difference between where we're currently at with regards to virtual worlds and how people interact, and where you feel that they should really be going to?
I don't think it's just virtual worlds. I think it goes back to a lack of recognition of the basic humanity of people with disabilities. I think it goes far beyond the whole concept of virtual worlds. And I think the U.S. is a real problem in this area because people look to the U.S. in terms of many, many countries have created their own accessibility laws based off of the U.S.'s ADA laws. But the U.S. is lagging in a lot of ways. I can give you an example. The UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, they call it CRPD, Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. I can post that in here for Lori Vaughn. That was the Human Rights Treaty that was set up, I think, about 2007, about when we were doing virtual ability in Rockcliffe. And what's really neat about the UN Convention is that it outlined 8 principles, and I'm going to put those in here for Lori Vaughn as well. So it says that we must respect human dignity, we must non-discriminate, we must include people with disabilities and respect their diversity, we must offer them equality of opportunity, we must make sure that the environment is accessible, respect gender equality, and respect children with disabilities. Now, in the past 10 years, this convention has been signed by 172 different countries around the world, and it's been signed by the European Union. The US has not signed it. Why not? Well, there's a couple of reasons, which I think are fallacious. Some people have argued, some politicians have argued, that it gives the United Nations jurisdiction over U.S. laws. And that's not true. But the funniest argument that I've come across, that I've heard, was the Homeschool Legal Defense Association. The homeschoolers claim that that last principle of respect for children with disabilities, that's going to take away the parents' rights to make decisions for and about their own child. So the U.S. is very definitely behind the rest of the world in this respect, that we are not going along with everyone else in terms of recognizing the rights, the basic human rights of persons with disabilities. I know, Electra, how do they even make that assumption?
Well, I mean, not having read that particular document, right? But I mean, on the surface, based on what you've just sort of shown us here, I mean, a lot of these things seem very much like motherhood statements, right? It's sort of the 10 Commandments. Thou shalt not kill, thou shalt honor thy father and thy mother, right? I mean, there's nothing in law that basically says.
Seems like pretty.
Yeah, and so on the surface, it actually seems, fairly innocuous in terms of what they've got there. I guess I'm sort of thinking standards in terms of going several layers deeper. And there's nothing to say that a standard has to necessarily be a law, right? There's lots and lots and lots of standards. You look at ANSI, you look at ICO, you look at SEN, you look at the Canadian Safeties Association. I mean, there's all kinds of standards that are out there, and they're exactly that, a standard. They're not a law. They're not a legal requirement that thou must do the following. Yeah, I guess I find it's fascinating sometimes, well, in a bad way, right? That, I mean, we get things like this, and then you have major players, and unfortunately it ends up being the U.S. in a lot of cases. I mean, similar type of thing with the, I don't really want to go down this particular route for today, but I mean, like, you look at the Paris Peace Accords, right? And with regards to greenhouse gases and what have you, right? And here it is, the U.S. is looking at pulling back from those. Quite often we get these agreements where you've got out of 212, 220 countries around the world, where you get 70, 80% of all the countries agreeing, and then you got the two or three major players that basically say, I'm not going to do that because I've got some special interest group that doesn't like it.
Yeah, it's a problem.
Yeah. Do you see us being able to, I mean us, when I'm talking us, I mean as a society, right? I mean us being able to use this idea of virtualization, being virtual, being able to have these particular types of conversations and to try to influence opinion, right? I mean, do these technologies help in that regard? Do they hurt?
I think they help. I think it's going to be a slow process, but look at the virtual world's best practices in education. VWBPE is becoming more and more accessible all the time, and your emphasis on accessibility is transmitted to the presenters from the physical world who come in to present at VWBPE, and it's being transmitted to the attendees who don't come, all of them, from Second Life. Some of them come specifically into Second Life for that conference. So you're getting that ripple effect. It's coming out.
I want to talk a little bit about technology itself, right? We sort of talked around it a little bit. But I guess one of the things that I find, I guess I find a lot of things interesting. It's either that or I'm stuck on that phrase, one or the other. I mean, we have so much innovation that's occurring. And I hate to say it, but when I was a kid, we got to play with dirt, right? And now you've got, if you don't have an iPad by the time you're 3 years old, you're sort of behind the curve. Okay, that's probably a bit of an exaggeration, but
it's true.
Right, you sort of get the idea. But I mean, we've got so much technology that's coming out. We have so many innovative things that are happening, and gadgets, drones, these other types of things. It almost seems, however, as if, notwithstanding the fact that groups are becoming better educated, like it's not perfect. You can see that from the U.S. Census statistics, but there does seem to be a trend towards greater understanding that things need to be more accessible, and yet a lot of these gadgets that are meant to make our lives easier continually come out without any type of a thought towards accessibility.
Right. Unfortunately, that's true.
Yeah, I mean, do you see that as having improved over the last, from your perspective, because you're more in touch with the community, obviously, than I am. Do you see that as actually continuing to be the case? Like, is that getting worse or is it getting better?
I think it's going a little bit in both directions. I think as awareness increases and as you see more of us out and about using our assistive technology, we're not hidden away like we used to be a generation or two ago. I think the awareness is increasing, but I think people are not getting the idea pushed at them as much as in the past. I recently talked with a website developer who had no idea what alt text would be used for. No clue why you should put alt text behind every important image on your website. It was amazing to me because I thought everyone knew the purpose of alt text, but especially website developers, I would think, would know that. But apparently they're not teaching that anymore, or not as much, not emphasizing it. So we're making some progress here, and we're losing a little ground there. So, but I think overall we're slowly making progress.
Excellent. Well, Gentle, I think for the moment, that's all the questions I've got right at the moment for you. I'd like to thank you very much for, it's been a while since we've had an Inside the Avatar Studio session, and we're sort of trying to get this kicked back off again. And I'm very much a fan of both yourself and everything that virtual abilities has been doing over the past 10 years. And I'd like to thank you very much for being on the program here with us.
Can I ask you one final question?
Absolutely.
We'll reverse.
You can ask me anything you'd like.
What do you think is the most common assistive technology that people use with computers?
The most common
type of assistive technology that people use with computers. The audience can type their guesses too. See what the audience thinks. What do you think is the most common type of assistive technology that people use with computers?
Well, it's definitely not Cortana, because I turn that off immediately as soon as I go to install Windows. That little app drives me nuts. I'm thinking the mouse, but I'm also thinking that I'm wrong.
Most common type of assistive technology that people use, not just with computers, but in general, are eyeglasses. We don't even think about eyeglasses being assistive technology, but they truly are. That's the answer.
I never would have associated those two. and yet here I am sitting with my eyeglasses on, because otherwise I can't read the text that's scrolling by.
Right, I know.
Yeah, but at the same
it takes her. She may need to have a new prescription.
I just got one a little bit recently, and I hate to say it, but I mean it's one of those things with regards to, I guess, getting older, right? It's like, because some of these things are age onset in terms of,
right?
Various, and there are things that everybody needs to go through, right?
So farsightedness becomes normal as we age.
Yeah. Yeah, and yet, it's even that can be considered I guess a trap, so to speak, with regards to the concept of what is or isn't normal, and how we're sort of perceived, and how, I guess to a certain extent. Sorry, complete tangent. I guess to a certain extent, not only how we're perceived, but how we perceive ourselves.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
See, your questions are very thought-provoking.
I try. I don't always get there, but I try. Anyway, Gentle, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. I'm going to hold up the stream in a couple of moments here, but anybody that's in the audience here, please feel free to continue to ask questions once we wrap up the live stream. So, again, thank you very much, and hopefully we'll have another one of these in about a month.